As I continued my journey, I could feel the weight of my responsibility as both a judge and a prophetess. I was in a world dominated by men, yet I had been called by God to lead a people desperate for deliverance. This is the story of how I, a woman in a time of oppression, stepped forward to fulfill God's divine plan, alongside those who dared to follow his call, against all odds. The midday heat was relentless, bearing down on the hills of Ephraim like a heavy weight. Sitting beneath the shade of my palm tree, my usual refuge, I watched the people come to me seeking justice. Men and women from all the tribes brought their disputes, land, crops, animals, and each case seemed heavier than the last. It was not just the work of a judge, it was the responsibility of being a bridge between the people and God. That afternoon, a woman approached hesitantly. Her eyes cast downward and her posture bent, revealing a life filled with deprivation and fear. "My lady," she began, her voice weak and trembling, "my neighbor has taken my land. He says that because I am a widow with no children, I cannot fight for it." As she spoke, I felt silent anger rise within me. It wasn't just her case, it was the entire nation of Israel that lived under oppression. For 20 years, Jabin, the king of Canaan, and his commander Sisera had crushed our people. Their iron chariots were symbols of their strength and our weakness. I ruled on her case, ordering that her land be returned, but the weight of what I had just heard stayed with me. When the crowd finally dispersed, I remained alone beneath the palm tree. The warm wind blew gently, but my mind was restless. I closed my eyes and murmured a prayer. "Lord, how much longer will our people suffer? What do you want from me? Show me your way." Then came the vision. It wasn't something I could see with my eyes, but a clarity that filled my soul. I saw Barak, son of Abinoam, leading men on Mount Tabor. I saw Sisera's iron chariots mired in mud and heard the sound of victory. Not ours but the Lord's. One phrase stood out above all: "I will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." My breath caught, my heart raced. I knew this was not just a message, it was a calling. But I also knew it would be a monumental mission. To summon an army, inspire a broken people, and face the greatest enemy we knew? It would only be possible with the hand of God. The next morning, I called for Barak. Barak arrived at noon, his imposing figure casting a long shadow as he walked toward me. He was known for his courage, but also for his hesitation in confronting challenges that seemed insurmountable. He looked at me warily, perhaps wondering what a woman like me could want from a warrior like him. "Welcome, Barak," I said, pointing for him to sit under the palm tree. He remained standing, arms crossed, his expression closed. I ignored his initial resistance and went straight to the point. "The Lord God of Israel commands you," I began, my voice firm. "Gather 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them to Mount Tabor. There, the Lord will deliver Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, into your hands." Barak lowered his head, processing my words. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with doubt. "How? They have iron chariots, Deborah, trained soldiers. And we? We have farmers with sickles and sticks." His disbelief was understandable. For years, Israel had been crushed by the military superiority of the Canaanites. But I could not allow fear to rule him. "You are looking at their strength, Barak," I responded. "But God has already secured the victory. You don't need to understand, just obey." He averted his gaze, struggling internally with his doubts. After a long silence he replied, "I will go, but only if you go with me. If you do not go, I will not go." For a moment, I remained silent. His hesitation frustrated me, but I also understood. He was not a coward, he was a man wounded, worn down by years of defeat. He needed more than a divine command, he needed a symbol that God was with us. "I will go with you," I said, my voice filled with conviction. "But know this, the glory of this victory will not be yours. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Barak looked at me, surprised. Perhaps he expected me to try to persuade him otherwise, but those words seemed to awaken something within him. He nodded, accepting the mission. In the following days, Barak began gathering the men of Naphtali and Zebulun. They arrived in small groups, bringing agricultural tools and makeshift weapons. Many were visibly afraid, murmuring amongst themselves about the impossibility of facing Sisera's iron chariots. I walked among them, listening to their stories, encouraging them with words of faith. One night, I sat beside Barak around a campfire. He stared at the flames, his hands gripping an old sword. "They believe in you, Deborah," he said, his voice low. "But is that enough?" "They don't need to believe in me," I replied. "They need to believe that God is with us. And that, Barak, is more than enough." He didn't respond, but I saw something change in his eyes. There were still doubts, but also a growing determination. It was the beginning of what God was doing in his life. That night, before going to sleep, I looked up at the starry sky and whispered a silent prayer. "Lord, guide us. May every step be led by your hand." Mount Tabor began to fill with men. They arrived in small groups, many bringing work tools transformed into makeshift weapons, sickles, hammers, axes. Their patched clothes and weathered faces were testimonies to the hardships they had endured under the yoke of Jabin and Sisera. They were not warriors but ordinary men, moved by something greater than themselves, the promise of deliverance. Barak was at the center of the camp, organizing the newcomers. He gave orders in a firm voice, but his posture betrayed the tension he felt. It was clear that the sight of the makeshift army concerned him. There were no shining armors or sharp swords, only simple tools and a cautious desire for freedom. I walked among the men, listening to their murmurs. Many were restless, fearful. "How can we fight against iron chariots?" asked one young man to another. His voice was heavy with doubt. "They have trained soldiers and we have this." As I approached, I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Do you think God needs weapons to win a battle?" I asked, my voice calm yet firm. The young man looked at me, surprised. "He has already promised the victory. It's not the strength of our hands that matters, but our faith. Do you trust that God is with us?" He nodded slowly, still uncertain, but visibly affected. Words like these needed to be repeated continuously. Each man carried his own doubts, and each needed encouragement that was deeper than fear. In the following days, the camp began to take shape. Barak trained the men in basic formations, teaching them to use the tools they had as weapons. I continued to walk among them, encouraging them, reminding them of God's promises. Little by little, the atmosphere began to change. Fear was still present, but a spark of hope was beginning to emerge. The night before the battle, I gathered the men around a campfire. Their expressions were a mixture of anxiety and determination. I spoke to them, my voice clear and firm. "Men of Israel, tomorrow we do not fight for ourselves. We fight because God has called us. He has already promised the victory. Do not worry about the iron chariots or the strength of the enemy. They are nothing before the Lord." The murmurs transformed into a reverent silence as I continued. "Today, we are shepherds, farmers, ordinary men. But tomorrow, we will be witnesses to the power of God. Remember this when we march." Later, I sat beside Barak, who stared silently into the fire. "You have inspired them," he said finally. "But is that enough?" "It is not we who will do this, Barak," I replied. "It is God. He doesn't need our strength. He only needs our faith." Barak nodded, and something changed in his expression. There was still a trace of doubt, but also a renewed determination. He was starting to believe. The dawn of the battle day brought a gray, overcast sky. The air was heavy with the promise of rain. From the top of Mount Tabor, I looked down into the Kishon Valley, where Sisera's army was already positioned. It was an intimidating sight. Neatly arranged rows of well-armed soldiers, and in the center, the iron chariots glinted even under the weak morning light. The sound of horses and wheels echoed through the valley, a reminder of the enemy's strength. The men of Israel stood behind us, tense and silent. Some gripped their makeshift weapons with trembling hands, others murmured quiet prayers. I knew that fear still hung over them, but I also knew this was the moment to remind them they were not alone. Barak approached, his posture tense as he observed the enemy's army. "They are ready, Deborah," he said, his voice heavy. "What about us?" I gently touched his shoulder, meeting his gaze. "Today, the Lord will deliver Sisera into our hands," I replied. "Do not hesitate, Barak. Trust." I turned to the men and raised my voice, strong and clear. Men of Israel, do not fear the iron chariots or their numbers. This battle belongs to the Lord. He fights for us, and today we will see his mighty hand at work. With my command, Barak led the men down the mountain. I stayed at the top, watching as they marched toward the valley. My heart was full of silent prayers. Lord, lead them. Show your strength. Be with us. When the two armies finally collided, the sound of battle filled the air. The roar of the iron chariots, the war cries of the Canaanites, and the clash of weapons were deafening. But then, the sky broke. The rain began as a light drizzle, but quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The dry ground of the valley became slippery mud, and the iron chariots, once the greatest weapon of Sisera, became useless. The wheels sank, the horses slipped, and the Canaanite soldiers struggled to maintain their formations. Chaos overtook the enemy's army. From the top of the mountain, I raised my hands and cried out, "The Lord fights for Israel. Advance, for the victory is already ours." The men of Israel, seeing the panic among the Canaanites, advanced with renewed strength. It was as if the very sky was fighting on our side. Barak led with courage, his sword cutting through the air as he urged the men forward. But even amidst the chaos, I saw Sisera. He abandoned his stuck chariot and fled on foot, disappearing into the confusion. My heart tightened. The battle was won, but God's promise was not yet complete. I knew the fate of Sisera lay in the hands of another woman. As the victory cries echoed through the valley, I whispered a final prayer. Lord, may your word be fulfilled, as you have promised. The Kishon Valley was silent, except for the soft sound of rain and the murmurs of celebration among the men of Israel. Sisera's army was defeated, their iron chariots abandoned in the mud, and their soldiers either fleeing or fallen on the battlefield. But my heart was restless. Sisera had escaped. The Lord had promised that he would be delivered into the hands of a woman, and I knew the prophecy still awaited fulfillment. As the battlefield transformed into a testimony of divine victory, Sisera ran. His clothes were drenched and covered in mud, his stumbling steps revealing the weight of defeat and exhaustion. He knew his army was lost, but his survival depended on finding shelter. In the distance, he spotted a solitary tent. It was the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Heber had maintained friendly relations with the Canaanites, and Sisera believed he would be safe there. He approached with heavy steps, his body slumped with fatigue. When he reached the entrance, Jael was already there, waiting. Jael's eyes met Sisera's, and though she knew who he was, she kept her calm demeanor. "Come in, my lord," she said, her voice gentle and welcoming. "Do not fear. Here you will be safe." Sisera entered, his breath ragged. He nearly collapsed to the ground, but Jael helped him settle. "I am thirsty," he said, his voice weak. "Give me some water." Jael went to fetch milk instead of water, a gesture full of intention. The milk would calm Sisera's nerves, lulling him to sleep. She handed him the container with a gentle smile, and he drank eagerly before lying down on the floor. She covered him with a blanket, as a mother would care for a child. "Stay by the door of the tent," he ordered, his voice now weaker. "If anyone comes, tell them there's no one here." Jael nodded, but in her mind, she already knew what needed to be done. This man, who had spread terror across Israel, was now in her hands. It was no accident that he had chosen her tent. God had placed this moment before her, and she knew it was her role to act. The tent was submerged in silence. Sisera slept deeply, his exhausted body finally yielding to the weight of defeat and the calming effect of the milk. Jael remained still for a moment, watching him. Her heart raced, but not out of fear. It was the gravity of what she was about to do that made her hands tremble slightly. She took a tent peg and a hammer, tools she knew well, used to secure her home. Now, they would be instruments of liberation. Every move she made was deliberate. Each step toward the man who had terrorized Israel was a declaration of her courage and faith. As she positioned the peg beside Sisera's head, Jael reflected. "Who am I to do this? Just an ordinary woman, living on the margins of the conflict. But God chose me. And if He chose me, I am enough." With a decisive blow, she drove the peg into Sisera's temple, piercing his skull. He had no time to react. His life was taken in silence. Jael stood still for a moment, the hammer still in her hand, as the reality of what she had just done took hold of her. It was not joy she felt, but a deep sense of purpose. Shortly after, Barak arrived at the tent, still searching for the enemy commander. He looked tired but determined. When he saw Jael emerge from the tent, his expression was one of surprise. He hadn't expected to find her there, much less with the calm expression she wore. "Come," Jael said, her voice firm yet serene. "I'll show you the man you're looking for." She led him into the tent, where Sisera lay on the floor, the peg still lodged in his head. Barak stood silent, absorbing the scene before him. He knew what it meant. Deborah's prophecy had been fulfilled. The Lord had delivered Sisera into the hands of a woman. "It was you," he said finally, his voice full of admiration. Jael nodded, but responded simply, "It was God. I only did what he placed on my heart." When the news of Sisera's death reached the Israelite camp, victory cries echoed through the hills. The cycle of oppression had ended. That night, I sat beneath my palm tree and reflected on all that had transpired. Every moment, the hesitation of Barak, the courage of Jael, the faith of the people, was proof that God was in control. I looked up at the stars and whispered one final prayer. "Lord, your promise has been fulfilled. May this victory be remembered forever as a testament to your faithfulness." The dawn of the next day brought a clear, bright sky, as if the world were at peace for the first time in decades. The people began to gather around my palm tree, their faces illuminated by a joy we had not seen in a long time. It was not just the victory on the battlefield that we celebrated, it was the liberation from an oppression that had weighed heavily upon us for 20 years. Standing on a rise so all could see me, I raised my hands to silence the crowd. A reverent silence took hold of all. I took a deep breath and began to sing, allowing the words to flow from my heart, guided by the Lord. "Praise the Lord, O kings. Sing, O rulers. For when the leaders lead with courage and the people offer themselves willingly, the Lord manifests himself. Hear, O mountains, tremble, O valleys. For the God of Israel marched ahead of his people and delivered the oppressor into our hands." My voice echoed through the hills, and the people listened intently, reliving the events that brought us here. I reminded them of how God called Barak, of his initial hesitation, but also of his obedience to the call. I narrated the descent to the Kishon Valley and the storm that turned the battlefield into mud, making Sisera's iron chariots useless. In the Kishon Valley, the sky fought for us. The waters swept away the enemy, the iron chariots sank in the mud. It was not by the strength of our hands, but by the hand of the Lord. The crowd began to murmur in approval, their expressions of reverence turning into smiles of celebration. The climax of the song came when I exalted Jael, the woman who had fulfilled God's promise. Most blessed among women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite. With a peg and a hammer, she destroyed the oppressor. With her own hands, she brought freedom to God's people. The murmurs grew until they transformed into applause and cheers of approval. Jael, who was present among them, seemed surprised by the attention. I saw tears in her eyes as she received looks of admiration and words of gratitude. Her humility was evident, but in that moment, she became a symbol of courage and obedience. Finally, my song shifted in tone, becoming an exhortation. "Wake up, O leaders of Israel. Do not fall again into the apathy that brought oppression to our people. The Lord is faithful, but he demands our faithfulness. May this victory not be forgotten, but passed down to future generations as a reminder that God never abandons his people." When I finished, silence fell once again over the crowd. It was as though the words were still echoing in their hearts. Then, someone began to repeat the lines of the song, and soon everyone joined in, their voices filling the air with praise and gratitude. It was not just a celebration, it was a renewal of faith. The next 40 years were marked by peace that Israel had not known in decades. During this time, Deborah's song was recited and sung across the land, passed down from generation to generation. It was not just a reminder of victory, but a reminder that faithfulness to God is the foundation of all liberation. Jael became an inspiration to the women of Israel. Her story was told around the fires and taught to children as an example of courage and obedience. She, who was neither a warrior nor a leader, showed that anyone, when used by God, can accomplish great things. Barak, for his part, continued to lead with humility and courage. He recognized that the victory did not come from his strength, but from the hand of the Lord. Often, young warriors sought his counsel, and he taught them that true strength comes from faith. As for me, I continued to judge Israel, leading with the same conviction I had always had. Whenever someone questioned my position as a woman in a leadership role, I would respond with a smile. Remember that God chose a woman to lead when no one else was willing to hear his call. On my last night under the palm tree, I sat alone, gazing at the starry sky. I thought of all we had gone through, the hesitation of Barak, the courage of Jael, the faith of the people, and the faithfulness of God. Every detail was a testimony that he works through the unlikely to accomplish the impossible. I murmured one last prayer before resting. Lord, may this story live forever in the hearts of your people. May we never forget that when we trust in you, all things are possible. And so, the story of Deborah, Jael, and Barak became a landmark in Israel, a reminder that God is always faithful, and that he uses those who trust in him to change the course of history.